always said this was not my story, it is his story. And by doing this, I think it's become our story. I knew I had to develop a positive attitude or else I wouldn't make it through the treatment process. And so the journey began. I kept telling myself I wasn't going to die like my mother. I knew there were so many advances in medicine that I was counting on a cure.
My favorite thing about Susan is the strength and stability. There's a steadiness and a determination that you can learn to rely on, that's always there. Knowing that someone is always there and is always strong creates a great ability for me to relax in some ways.
Shalom Aleichem, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Shmoozing with Avi. Today we have very special guests, and it's a very beautiful and loving story that they have to tell. Sam Simon. I have recently discovered this man and his story. He is the author and performer, the playwright, the everything of the program called The Actual Dance. And he describes this work as his fourth age because he comes to it after a career as a very prominent member of America's consumer movement. And this is the part that really excited me in this schmooze. Trained as a lawyer, he started his career as one of the original members of Ralph Nader's first legal advocacy group in Washington, D.C. in 1970. Early in his career, his leadership was recognized through a profile in the New York Times, but since then, Sam was a regular on national news programs such as Face the Nation, The Today Show, The Good Morning America, CBS Morning News, The Nightly News, one of my favorites, The Phil Donahue Show, as well as The Oprah Winfrey Show. But in 2008, he began what he called his third age, following the sale of his consumer affairs firm in Washington. And he became a senior fellow with the nonprofit Intersections International, a social justice initiative of the Collegiate Church of New York. I am fascinated by this because to me, this is all tikkun olam. And I'm sure we'll talk about that, making the world a better place, social justice, and one of the reasons I love Jewish so much. He has transitioned from that work to serve on the advisory board there. And then he devoted himself full-time to The Actual Dance. He returned to the theater. In the late 1990s, he's performed with many companies in Washington, D.C. He wrote the play, The Actual Dance, in 2013. He's performed it ever since, over 100 times, and the soon-to-be-released book and the play are autobiographical, and I would like very much to invite Sam and Susan Simon to join us in our schmooze.
Wow.
Shalom Aleichem, Sam. Hello,
Shalom
Susan. Welcome to my show. This is a very informal show where we get to schmooze for as long as we need to, because I think you have a lot of important things to say. For those of our audience who don't know about The Actual Dance, can you give us a very short summary of what it is and how you came to put it together and perform it?
Thank you. And thank you for having us, and such a delightful energy that you bring to being Jewish. The Actual Dance, I like to say, found me. It came out of a moment in my life that I didn't understand when it happened necessarily. It is a story, it's autobiographical. I had not written a play, had not performed a play, but it involved a period of time when I thought I was going to lose Susan to breast cancer. In fact, so did the doctors at the time. It seemed inevitable. And it's interesting that we went through that process, and I don't think I understood what happened to me. The stories in the play and in the now released book, But I began, as I was in New York more, I began doing improv, theatrical improv. I was privileged to work with some of the best improvisers in the country, Gary Austin in particular, who had founded the Groundlings in LA, and the very first folks who were Saturday Night Live were, and I did it to improve my life. But in that process, the actual dance found me. That as I let go, as I was learning, and improv is about letting go, right? About not being in control. And I started improvising things about characters or events that happened 10 years earlier and 11 years earlier. And as pieces of this came out, fellow actors, and so my teacher said, more, right? They said, give us more of that. And so it took a while, and and as I'm sure you know, a lot of people, a lot of help, and I had a dramaturg, somebody who helped me write a play, learn how to write a play, or in this case, it's really a one-person show, so we call it a play, and it's a form of a monologue, but it's performative, and it does have two musicians on stage now that we have some original music, but it is the story of how do you do what you think you can't possibly do. The metaphor of the actual dance, and we'll get to that if we want to, but what came out of what was happening in my mind, and that was when I thought, what would happen when Susan would take her last breath, is that we would be dancing in a ballroom, and I would be holding her, and we would be dancing to the music of our heart, the music, the song we wanted to, and that she would just slip away, disappear. And took me a long time. I mean, there's a lot of the story about how it took me to get to that full vision. And even now, I learn, and I know you've got some theatrical background too. I learn from what I do. It's, I wrote it, both the book, and even now when I do it and I hear back from audiences, right, I learn.
The secret to acting is honesty. Now, I've done 6 one-man shows, and I've dramaturged many, many projects over the years. So I understand the technicality of it, but honesty is the bottom line. And you came to this honestly, with your full heart. It's such a profound story. Let me read something that I found on your website, an audience response, apparently. It has broad appeal and presents the point of view that is almost never heard. It's the man's story and voice in the breast cancer experience. It is a love story, and it's a story that explicitly talks about confronting the most dreaded possible experience, taking the person you love most in the world through the end of life. Yes. Now, to me, that is such a deep and beautiful concept. And now what I would like to know is, what is it in your back? I was always an actor. So for me to do 6 one-man shows and dramaturg a lot of projects is not that big a surprise. But you, my friend, you had a very different upbringing. You came out of a very, very different world. And Susan, I would love to hear more about your background. So if you two could tell us just for a moment, where were your families from? How did you grow up? Where did you grow up? I assume, we talked about our love of Judaism. Where was the Judaism in your life, and how did that affect the work that you're doing? And then how did you meet? And how did you decide to deal with your situation this way?
So let us start.
Yes.
Right? We love, in part, this part of our story. We met when we were 16 years old. Now, you have to know a little bit about Texas. I was in El Paso, Texas. And yes, there was a Jewish community in El Paso, and there still is. And I was in the youth group, right? B'nai B'rith Youth. I was in AZA as a teenager. Being Jewish was very important to my parents. They they came into, they're from the era of the 30s, 20s and 30s. My dad, they're not living now, but they came through the war. They were the El Paso on my mother's side. Her father, who had been born in Poland, had come to El Paso. And then my father's side, their family were in St. Louis, but they came from Germany. So my parents were first natural born American Jewish family. And there's a lot of, it's not baggage, there's a lot of stuff in that. I learned, for example, that my mother, I assume you've seen the play Last Night of Ballyhoo.
Yeah.
Are you familiar? Well, I saw, we saw that in New York together. And I said, that's my mother.
Mm-hmm.
That's, my daughter saw it and said we should see it. She thought it was a comedy. I saw it, I said, that's my mother. There are the good Jews and the bad Jews. There's the, and we grew up in El Paso, there's that kind of people and this kind of people. And you don't hang out with them. And it was so interesting to, so being Jewish was part of our lives. It was, we were Reformed and weren't observant in an Orthodox way. But somebody I've since, a dear friend of mine, a rabbi, we used to say being Jewish was in his DNA. And that's what it's felt like to us. It's just, it's an essential part of who we are. It makes up our personhood. So I was in El Paso, Nazier. Now, she grew up in Houston, Texas, which is closer to, El Paso is closer to LA than to Houston, but she grew up in Houston.
Your BBYO was very big there. I was in the girls part of the BBYO functioning. BBG. Now, my life was very different from what Sam described. I had a grandmother that came to the United States from Russia, which is now Russia, or Poland. Exactly. We don't know. She was the first one to come and bring over other members of her family. It was a cousin that sponsored her. Our grandmother lived with us. And so I heard all the stories about, how it was and how she had to escape. And I learned many years later from my brother that when we were talking about Fiddler on the Roof, that was the reason Grandma left Russia, because she didn't like the man they had picked for her to marry. So she escaped right away. And they had a store which was in the Heights neighborhood of Houston, and it was a dry goods store. And even after her husband died, she raised her two boys, my father and his brother, and they both ended up in the clothing business, the two boys. But we were in a situation where she was more religious than the rest of us. But when she would go away with her sisters for 2 weeks every summer, my mother, who was more Reformed, would bring in the pork chops and the ham.
So you grew up conservative and you were in BBG.
Yeah.
And it was
Texarkana that we met.
I'm trying to remember the year, and I don't know if I can. We were 16, so 45, 16, 50 something. We both went to a regional convention in Texarkana, Texas. And the story, it's in the play, it's in the book, is I remember noticing her. I happened to have been running for a regional office. I didn't win, so I don't know why. I've always been the guy trying to, do something. But I think she was flirting with me. But the funny part of it is there's this clear memory, and again, it's in the play, it's in the book, is as I was leaving at the end of the convention, I noticed her. I thought I noticed her. She was looking at me, and the bus came by bus, right? And it's pulling out of the parking lot of the hotel where the convention was. And I noticed this curly head, big braces, young, girl waving at the bus. I thought, is she waving at me? And she later told me she was. So was.
Wow, what a beautiful, beautiful story. So just FYI, I'm sure you know of a play called The Immigrant by
Yes.
Mark Harlick, who also tells of his grandparents who went to Texas from Russia. And it's a beautiful story about a Jewish family in Texas. So I am not only fascinated now even more by everything you're telling me, because the idea that there are a lot of Jews in Texas, I actually performed in Corpus Christi. I did a show called Too Jewish in a church, in a Catholic church in Corpus Christi, surrounded by statues of Jesus on the cross. And it was one of my best performances ever.
You know, I almost want to wonder whether we might have seen it, because we had a niece living there. We remember we were there in Corpus Christi and watched a play of some sort, but who knows?
I don't know. Who knows?
It was a one-man show. Perhaps I influenced you in some way to develop.
You never know.
Yeah.
You know, and 3 years later, it was called Texas Western College. I graduated high school 3 years later, and I go to Texas Western. It's famously known now, and with the University of Texas at El Paso, but it was famous because it was the first all-black basketball team, and they won the NCAA championship. The first time an all-black squad for part of the game was ever on the court. Susan's family, turns out, who knew, that she had a cousin, the Gibbons, were
living in El Paso.
And you know, the Gibbons shoe store. If you're anybody listening from El Paso, the Gibbons shoe store, there was a big shoe store. And because her brother had been stationed in the military in El Paso, and that they had the cousin, the Gibbons, Susan, like many of us in the 60s, wanted to get I'm telling you the story, but get as far away from home and be in state. She went to college, and we reconnected in college. And we obviously knew each other. There's funny, great stories about exactly when we it was a double date. She had a date with somebody else, and I had a date with somebody else, and we switched dates in the middle of that date. But that's how we came to know each other.
All of this is in the book.
All of it in the book and in the play. Not as much. You said the play is an hour long, 2,100 words. The book is 200 some odd pages and 65,000 words.
Wow.
So get into the details.
But needless to say, the book will be optioned soon for a major motion picture. And you'll have to tell me before the end of the interview, who do you want to play you and Susan? All right. So you can think about that in the meantime. But I guess I would love to find out a little bit more about, after you've met, you've now fallen in love, but your first choice is not to be an actor. You're not going to school to learn how to be a theater person. And Susan, I'm not sure what career you may have pursued, but you ended up a lawyer, and you ended up working on some major social justice issues, which is interesting in the context of what you just told us about the all-black, the first all-black team to play basketball in that situation. So can you tell us a little bit more about so is that the first stage? What you just told us is the first stage, yes?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. So that was your childhood, your upbringing, you meet Susan, you fall in love, you go to college, and now the second stage, how did you meet Ralph Nader?
Well, let me go back to your underlying question, because it's one I always wonder about, even now at 76, right? The source of my energy for justice, or, it's in the book, and it's an incident. I was 14 years old. The city council in El Paso passed a law setting an this sounds mundane, but 11 p.m. Curfew. Anybody under 17 had to be in the, but the enforcement was all in South El Paso. They were just using it as an excuse to pick up Chicanos or the African American, the Hispanic kids. And I was outraged. And I did some research. I think Nelson Rockefeller, who was governor then, had given the view that it was unconstitutional. A 14-year-old kid with some personal research walked down to city council one day, unannounced, didn't tell my parents, took the bus because we didn't own a car, walking to city council. At the end of the council meeting, said, anybody else want to, anybody else say? I was the only one there. Does anybody else have anything to say? And I raised my hand. And I went up and told them how bad it was to have this curfew and that it was discriminatory. They told me, wait till I had kids. Or wait till I had teenagers, is what exactly they said. I still remember that. But I always had that energy, and I don't know where it came from. I really, honestly don't understand where it came from, but it was always part of who I was.
It came from your Jewish DNA,
Yes.
because the Jews were always involved in social justice, especially in the union and the labor movement in the 1880s and the early 1900s. When your grandparents came over, that's what the Jews were doing. They were getting involved in justice.
And I am in the generation, again, I don't know the right definition. For some reason, the end of the war and the war were a big part of me more than my family, per se. It was always, the Holocaust was on my consciousness. We had neighbors who were survivors. And I used to actually sneak down to the theaters and to see the newsreel. We didn't have TV. Even when it was first out, we couldn't afford TV. So I was fascinated, and that's become a big part of, another part of who I am, and working on that. Now, Susan's family were what I would call, well, my dad was a traveling salesman, and my mother, had second job. She ended up being a self-trained bookkeeper and speed typist. But both parents worked. Susan's mother, your mother didn't work.
No, she didn't work, but my grandmother worked till she was 80 in a jewelry store, because that was one of the things also that Jews did in those days. And when I was 12 years old, she said, you're old enough to come down to the store with me on Saturdays. So she wanted me to know what it was like to have a business, to be part. And of course, all the Jews came to this jewelry store. So we heard all the stories on Saturday. So I had plenty of stories when
She meant Sunday.
Yeah. So it was quite fun growing up. And it seemed like we were talking about remembrances, and I remember that everywhere we went, in every shop we worked into, and remember when we got married, you said, are you related to everybody? We had an uncle that was a baker. We had another one that owned a grocery store. They all came to America because this was what they dreamed of, and their dreams came true, and they were able to do what they wanted to do. But I can always remember that every Saturday I spent, Ann Summers, she had me working in the jewelry store with her.
And career-wise, just briefly, because working for Ralph Nader, well, this is a nice transition. This generation probably doesn't remember. Working for Ralph Nader meant not getting paid much, like a lot, not much. So we, right out of, God, what is it? Right out of college, 77.
The law schools?
So, right, so go to Ralph Nader in 1970, but, and right, in 1971 in law school, we had our first child. Our son, Marcus, who is now 51, and a member of the Virginia legislature, so a politician. We have a kid. I'm in law school. She's working to support us. while I'm in law school because I'm not making much money. She had a degree in sociology and was working as
Worked at the base when you were in the Army, teaching the soldiers English because they, so that, but it, and then I went, worked when we moved here.
But in Austin, you worked at the state hospital, psychiatric social worker. And I tell you, that was she had to jump out a window once, literally, for her safety. But, I'm going to insert something here. In the summer of 1969, a man, a fellow student, a year behind us, as Nader was becoming prominent and written unsafe at any speed in 65. And in law school, we were all social justice. I fell into that crowd. The students who we were civil rights movement, MLK had been assassinated, Kennedy had been assassinated, the civil rights movement, Kent State happened. And one of a student a year behind us named Joe Tom Easley, as of this week, blessed memory, went and worked for Ralph as a Nader's raider. And he came back and he recommended 3 of us to go to work for Ralph Nader. Now, another thing, and just and I presume it's not a surprise, my parents were very patriotic Americans. And they had me in ROTC. They wanted me to be a soldier because turns out my older sister married a West Point guy, and they wanted me to. I was in ROTC. I was going to have to go in for 3 years. Well, I was going to have to go in either for 2 years. That was a scholarship. I got one of the first ROTC scholarships, so I was going to have to go in. And I'd have to go into infantry. So now in 1970, I'm graduating law school. I want to go to law school, get a deferment, and there's a whole story behind that. They decided they didn't want me to, but we got it. So we had our first child, and Susan, literally through a lot of college itself, through law school, in the Army, she was supporting the family. Whether social work, she became a teacher.
Children that had special needs.
Wow.
Yeah.
But this was during a very different era. I mean, you mentioned the Holocaust and how patriotic. My father was in Auschwitz, so I understand. I'm first generation American. But you were coming up in a time of Vietnam and a radical change of systematic thinking. So that obviously played into your choices to go work with Ralph Nader.
There were 2 parts to it. It, I think, saved my life because otherwise, people may not remember. There was a period of time when the Army was short of first lieutenants because they were getting killed, sometimes by the Viet Cong and sometimes by their fellow soldiers because they were poor leaders. And I was on a path. If I had to go right into the Army in 70, I'd have gone to Fort Benning, Georgia, and Vietnam. And I viewed that as a death sentence. Who knows how it would have worked out. I didn't have to. I was granted as an exception to standing policy. Those are the words I used on the phone. A deferment to go to law school. And then by the time I was out of law school 3 years later, and I had this chance to go to work for Ralph Nader, and I called the Army and said, "Can I have some more time?" "Yeah, sure. How much time do you want?"
They
gave us
9 months.
9 months, almost a year. And so that first year, again, that was with our child, and and Susan worked in Washington that year. So, she made it all possible, and we had that year. And then the Nader experience is transformative. I like to say now to young people. We're actually working on those of us left from 1970, there were 13, there's I think 10 of us left now, working on a book of essays. And I like to say, be careful who your first job is and may decide the rest of your life. There's some wisdom in it. I think there's some truth in that at any rate. And I was lucky.
My first professional job was in the Yiddish theater in New York when I was 10 years old. And here I am.
Well, no, it's true. And in some ways, we're trying to make an argument to young people today, and even in this show, it might be good. Don't, if you can, don't obsess on it. Follow your passion. Don't try to think it out. What are you passionate about, and what works for you? It will, if you're there, you will figure a good life out. Now, that's my opinion. Right. Things don't always work out. The path may not be smooth.
So, Sam, I wanna get to the dance, the actual dance. Yes. But before we get there, what I'm learning now is that your involvement with Ralph Nader, I'd like to hear what it was that you did that got the New York Times to write about you, which then led to the opening up of the mass media, and all of this ends up becoming part of who you are, writing the actual dance.
There is a connection to this story in Susan. So there's a lot of detail about Ralph. There was 13 of us. The energy was great. Can you imagine? The first public interest law firm in the country. Ralph Nader can get headlines whenever he wants. It's a very heady time. And I had a very sort of an arcane project. I was working on the, corporations and property tax and how the corporations were extorting cities and the power of corporations, which is Ralph Nader's theme. And Eileen, again, a blessed memory, Eileen Shanahan, who was just a reporter for the Times, somehow was interested in this, came over to interview me late on a Friday afternoon, 5 o'clock maybe. And now, we didn't could afford 2 cars, so Susan would normally come with our baby Marcus to pick me up, to take me home. Well, I was in this, we didn't have cell phones. Susan had left, and Eileen Shanahan's interviewing me. So Susan parks the car and comes in, and by the way, the interview with Eileen wasn't going very well. She was sort of beating me up. Susan shows up at the door with this baby in her arms and looks in. Eileen sees Susan and say, "I'll be right with you, dears." Eileen, this is my wife, my new baby, Marcus. And she melts. And she melts. So it's a story of anybody want to get in the PR business. It's not about the brain, it's about the heart. And she referred Nan Roberts, who is a features reporter, to us, because the idea of a married, Ralph Nader had this big reputation, paying very little, being like a monk, and that was already established. And here was a guy, a married guy, and this baby, and we were doing it. So it had this beautiful, and it is serendipity. It's part of, it's true in theater, man. You got to show up. You got to try. You got to audition. You don't know what you'll get, and you don't know when events happen, but you have to be ready for them and be engaged. And luckily we were. It was the beginning. It wasn't just the only start. It was, there was a guy in the office at the time, one of the mortgages said, "Oh, Sam, you're made. Your rest of your life is made. You're in the New York Times." We were the little guy trying to take on the big guy, and Nader's still that. By the way, Ralph is got a podcast every week. He's still a friend. He's 87. He sponsored my show. When I say sponsored, he hosted it in his Washington office, around 2012 or 2014 or 2015. And as Ralph Nader would be, "Why didn't you go find another doctor?" which is his response. Yeah.
Well, I would be honored to interview Ralph Nader, because he is I remember very well that period. I was very young, but I do remember Ralph Nader very, very well. And I'm again, I'm very impressed by the fact that you're so understated about the important work that you were doing at the time for social justice. So you were with him for quite a while.
But just real quick, I had to leave 4 years to go into the Army. We stayed in the area only 2 years away from Washington because the Army couldn't handle me. Think about it for just a second. A Ralph Nader lawyer going into the U.S. Army.
Not a good idea.
The Army wanted me out of. In fact, I had to take the Fifth Amendment once in Fort Lee because I had an article published in the Nation magazine while on active duty. Without its approval, the Army had a program. Nixon had a program called drug amnesty. If soldiers were using drugs, they should turn themselves in and they wouldn't be prosecuted. A young African-American man walks into my office, said he turned himself in. First thing the Army did is he was in a draftee. They threw him in the hospital. And at first they added the time he was in the hospital onto his drafted time. And then they decided to administratively discharge him under less than honorable conditions. If you think you have to, this is technical. So they're not court-martialing him, but they're ruining his life.
Right.
And because less than honorable conditions is, in a life that's going to be hard to get a good job no matter what anyway. And so anyway, I was too much for the Army. That was my Nader days. That's my advocacy. Somebody could have asked, how do you be in the Army and be this kind of radical advocate? It's hard. I'll tell you, and the Army's not over it yet. And this has been 40 years, but so I went back and I served 2 more years in the Washington Office of Chief Trial Attorneys. And while I was there, I got to reconnect with the Nader people that I'd worked with. And, my second job was to continue to engage with them. But these were heady times, and they, the opportunity to do that, like there's some ego, the recognition. I love the work. I love the man, Ralph Nader. I know year 2000 has gotten a lot of people unhappy when he ran for president, and they blame him for Gore losing.
Right.
I understand the frustration, but I think it's important to say
he's still a very important figure in the history of America.
Well,
and what he accomplished was amazing, and he changed the world for the better.
It's like asking one of the Hebrew prophets, why didn't you stop? You talk about part of your DNA, and I know him well enough. He does it because it's who he is. Right. And he's gifted, as we all are. You're gifted as an actor. You see the world in particular. He sees the injustices in the world, and he cannot help but want to fix it. And he has a platform that he built and unique. And he has saved more lives in America.
Right.
When that time comes, it will be found more lives.
Sure, just the seatbelt. Yeah, the seatbelt
and the airbags.
Absolutely.
Dying, right?
And the airbags. So obviously you inherited a lot from your work with Ralph Nader. Right. So tell us a little bit about the third age and working with Intersections International. What is it? And is it a collegiate church? So you're a Jewish guy working at the church project. And how did that lead you ultimately into your fourth age and the actual dance?
So I'm going to run through some quick things. I do want to say, I created a public affairs firm when I got well, I went back to Ralph after I got out of the Army for 8 years, or I think that's right. And did, some people blame me. That's how I got on Oprah Winfrey about breaking up the phone company. And I wrote a book, Reverse the Charges, How to Save Money on Your Phone Bill, that book that Club distributed. Book of the Month Club distributed. Even worked with Bob Rice back then briefly. So I had that but there came a time where I needed to take a step out, and I created a public affairs firm that, on the idea that of literally intersections, it happens to connect, but it wasn't meant to mean to do that. No, of interest. As much as an advocate that I was, I didn't view that as I couldn't work with businesses. What I did is I created a company that grew and got significant, that meant that when there was a mutuality of interest between public interest groups and corporations, they could work something out. And there's a long story there. It was innovative when I started and controversial when I ended, because when I started, nobody was doing it, and everybody thought it was terrific. By the time I was ending it, there were people called it selling out. That division of you couldn't be in both places.
Right.
You couldn't be public interest and working for advocacy groups. But as they say, sometimes I did that for 25 years. And out of that came two things, but I'll mention just one. It was about getting government. There's a program that's called Lifeline, that money goes to public education. That the deal was negotiated in our offices. And as a result, about $50 billion has continued to flow to public education and still does. And sometimes, my thought is, sometimes you work 25 years for one thing. You never know. Sometimes you do that. So one of the people I worked with during that time is a man by the name of the Reverend Robert Chase. And he headed the Office of Communications of the United Church of Christ. He was the heir to a legendary man called the Reverend Dr. Everett Parker, who I had worked with, who at first thought I was somebody who was just playing in his field and wanted to get rid of me, to a loving relationship. And he is that kind. He started the media reform movement in this country. Bob was the successor. Everett introduced us. They said, you two should get to know each other. I started doing things with Bob. And in this life, Bob was hired by the Collegiate Church to head Intersections International. It was a brand new ministry of the Collegiate Church, founded by Norman Vincent Peale, by the way. And the Collegiate Church is huge. But they were starting a social justice ministry. They hired, he interviewed, and Reverend Robert Chase, my friend, was hired to be the minister to launch this social justice ministry. About that time, I was selling off my company, didn't know what I was going to do next. So one of these, we had lunch one December morning in 2007, maybe 2008, in the Mayflower. It's again one of those lunches or breakfast. No, it was breakfast, never forget. And he started telling me about it, what he was doing. And I don't know if you remember, I came home and I wrote him a letter, because they said, here's a 10-year project and $2 million, $20 million, God, $2 million a year. We want you to change the world. You figure out how to do it. Can you imagine getting that? And I
No, but I'd like to, if someone would offer that to me. I can think of several very good ways to do that.
And I went home and I wrote him a letter saying, Bob, nothing more I'd like to do in my in my third age, if you will, career, after I got in my mid 60s, is to be helpful. And so, it was in New York. So for, it was over, I don't know, about 5 years, 6 years of that time. I would go over every other week, stay in New York, work, do a lot of my theater work. So it let me cheat. I would work with Bob. I would do my theater classes at night. I would be part of a group that's still in New York called Artistic New Directions, now A&D Theater Company.
So what made you start to take acting classes and theater classes?
It was my improv. It was out of my improv. And the group that did my early improv work over summers, had a program in New York City. I knew the people, I kept going. And I love,
And when did you start this? Was this before you found out about Susan's?
DC.
yeah, before I went to New York, it was probably, oh, this is 2022. Was I doing it? Probably in the early 2000s and maybe late 1990s. I've been doing community theater in Washington. I did community theater when I was in high school. I was in the senior play. I did some community theater as an avocation. So theater was an avocation. I never took theater. I guess I was always, I don't know what prompted me to do it. I'm always out there.
Were you a theater goer? Did you guys go to the theater regularly?
We have membership to Kennedy Center.
We're looking at, well, not as kids. I laugh, you provoke it. I'm not a classical, he went to, his parents always took him to the theater and no. But I had an uncle. He was a Shriner, believe it or not. He was 8 feet tall, had these huge nose. And what we did go to is the concert hall. Every year the Shriners had a talent show.
I went to the circus.
Well, no, but also they had the Shriner talent show. And my uncle, Cindy Mandel, this very thin, tall guy in a tuxedo, in a bow tie, top hat, walks on stage first. There's a grand piano. He takes his time. He looks around. He sits down. He does this for 3 minutes, hits one key, stands up for the bow and leaves. But we were there for the entire show. So I don't know. It's different. It's not classic theater, right, but it's the use of theater. And it was a joy of our life. It was one of those things you laugh at and you remember and you love the man and the group and the time. I was in the high school band, so there's a performative aspect. I was in the city band, I played trumpet and tuba, believe it or not. So we had arts intermixed, but it wasn't a straight line, thank God. It was, a little bit of all around. But improv, but the core theory, even today, she hates it, but improv, I say, changed my life as much as anything. To learn how to live, in the moment, to accept all information given, to be generous and to honor your partner, whether it's a scene partner or a spouse or an employee, and adding information to it. That is not fighting, not denying, not demeaning. It's a huge life skill. And I would love for people to take it. You can tell I'm passionate about that. It helped me find the story, it's that part of being open. I forget his, Mamet's name of his book. One of our teachers had to read it, where he says, you don't need to go to acting school. You don't need training. You just need to walk on stage and honor the script. And I feel a little bit like that's me. I didn't know what I was doing. But you walk on and you honor the moment and honor the people. I want to say I wasn't necessarily natural. I don't know if anybody really is. And this is not comedic, right? Which is very different. It's theater and
yes,
and being present and listening and
which is a perfect segue to telling us about the actual dance and how you came to create it. Can you tell us about the day, Susan, that you must have found out about your diagnosis? and how did that work?
The diagnosis. Oh, about the diagnosis. We thought you were talking about when the day she heard about the play.
No, because you wrote the play because of her diagnosis.
Well, and it evolved over time. Yes, and
Right.
she knew it. Well, go ahead. We'll talk about the. So I'll give my end, and then you'll. Well, no.
Go ahead.
Well, no. It was the day I walk in. It's in the book, but I walk into the house. I'm working, 12 hours a day in my firm, and walking late. She had. I guess I knew you had a regular exam and our annual exam. Literally walk in the house and say, I grab a snack, start going. How did I had said how was your day? And she says, fine. The exam was fine. Blah blah. I start to turn away, and then she says,
the doctor wants me to go see a surgeon, a breast surgeon. She doesn't think it's anything, but she had been keeping tabs on, how because my mother had breast cancer, how I was doing every year. And she seemed to think that this year at the exam, maybe it was a little different, but she didn't excite me to say, oh, you must go right away or anything. But that was the beginning of it all. Once we went, and once we thought it was a scar from other mammograms, and then it turns into be the real thing.
Yeah, we had the breast surgeon said he should do a biopsy, and she had numbers. Her mother did pass away from metastasized breast cancer, so it's in the family. And when the doctors first examined you, he thought it was scar tissue too, right?
Right.
And he said, but we'll just do a biopsy and double check. And so this is the story of the actual part of the story is, don't worry, it's nothing. Takes a biopsy. And even then he said he looked just like he didn't see anything, didn't think it was anything. And, we get a call, got to come in. The lab tested the tissue and it was stage 3 is what it turned out. And so you go from, oh, life is normal, blah, blah, to, oh, so that was really the bigger moment, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just the check. It's when we went into his office and God, I wonder why these moments are so brilliant in our mind. I once, I hope you don't mind, I once did the play for the breast imaging department at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. And Dr. Jennifer Harvey headed the department, and she had seen it in Washington and invited me down for a conference. And it was mainly medical people. And it's the second time she's seen the show, and she walks out in tears. But she said something that has stayed with me again, that the medical community itself don't quite understand the role of the love part, what I call the love partner, the other person. That they tell people they have cancer over and over again, right? Somebody comes in, but the person who hears that, person who hears the word, me in this case, will never forget, and these were her words, but they're true, that they'll never forget the moment. She said, they'll remember what the light was like in the room. They'll remember the temperature in the room. They'll remember the smell in the room. She said, we won't even remember that the next week because we'll have gone through it over and over. But you have to be aware that when somebody is given a diagnosis of cancer, she hears it one way, but and I don't know if you have that brilliant a moment as I did. I think the minute she heard it, she was into how am I going to beat this thing?
Right.
Talk about
yeah, and he goes into things much deeper than I do. And that's part of the story too, because I said, just because my mother had breast cancer doesn't mean I'm going to die of breast cancer. And, you know, you have to be very, very positive about this whole thing, that everything is going to come out okay. You know, we're going to fight it. I'm going to fight it. And everything's going to come out okay. And little did I know what he's thinking, because he did a fine job of keeping it very, very private about what his feelings were and everything else. And was, you know, when he was around me, he would be the cheerleader. He would sit there when I was having chemo. He sat there, you know, when I went to radiation and all the different treatments. And he just kept, you know, if sometimes things didn't, if I felt, I didn't feel so good after this, you're gonna make it. What you're saying about that, it only
it's only for a while.
Yeah.
It's only for a while. Now, but broadly, she didn't want anybody around her who was negative, and there were some people in the community who, you know, would go that way. And you know, I would tell her, I mean, I wouldn't cry. I don't think I ever cried in front of you. I would go out on the front porch. Our daughter would come by and visit, and she later told me, and when she told her we're going to play, she said I would go. You know, she'd be at the cheerleading team too. She'd go out to her car, and that's where she would cry. So everybody did that. Now, the time you did cry, she knew I was working on a play, but she knew I was in New York, you know, all the time. And I was in this theater group thing, and I was working on some sort of play. And I didn't tell her what it was about. I was afraid that if I told her what this play was about, she wouldn't let me do it. So it was coming up for a Labor Day weekend. We had some friends who were living in Canada who were going to meet us in New York City. And it turns out one of my bigger readings was going to be on Labor Day in the living room of my friend in Upper West Side, right? Actually, it was in the Heights, near George Washington Bridge. But at any rate, Susan even couldn't stay for that, but the topic was going to come up. The jig was up. She needed to know. So on the train from Washington to New York, as we left the station, I said, Susan, I've got something I want you to read.
Wow.
And we go from there.
Yeah.
Well, you tell us.
And I read it and I cried. And he said at the end, what did you think of it? And I said, it's beautiful, with tears, you know, coming down. And all these people on the train turned around and looked at us like, are you okay? What's going on over there?
And that's the honesty that made you write a beautifully profound, loving piece that actually won awards. I mean, you won the Rosemary Williams Courage Award for this piece. Am I correct?
Yes, yes.
And the idea that you brought to it your perspective, I don't know how you got away with writing it without her finding out. That's the tough part. We have to.
Well, can I say one thing? Yes.
Sure, please.
Yes. And what I'm learning, and I don't know that it's a skill. Maybe it is. Maybe the facts argue that, but what I learned, this is the 9th year of performance. And based on some feedback from somebody who saw it, you know, we're doing it by Zoom now, that the reason it took me so long to find the play, to discover that and talk about it, was that if you think about it, when it happened, when she was diagnosed, we'd been married 34 years.
Wow.
She knew me pretty damn well. The ability to hide that fear, you think about that. I had to put that so deep inside of me. Now I think that, because I've actually, I haven't talked about it that much, but my own thought is, how could it not be so brilliant? Because it is brilliant. And when I say brilliant, not smart, but brilliant as a bright light in my life, in my head. But it was so deep inside of me. I had to make myself somebody different. That its resurgence, the welled up, whether it's in the head or the gut, I don't know. Yes, I'm certain. Maybe it's in the head. I don't know. It's sort of like delayed. In the book, I think I call it post-spiritual disorder, post-traumatic spiritual disorder, PTSD as post-traumatic spiritual disorder. I sort of think it's a form of coming to terms with, because I believe a universal truth in this is that the loss of a loved one, particularly an intimate loved one, is existential. It is for both parties.
Sure.
And, you're going to get me, it's going to take me to something. You had a question, I'm going to wait because
No. But I listen, what you said and what I read is that we all will eventually dance the actual dance.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's beautiful that you were able to take that concept and put it on paper, give it to Susan, who cried, and now we are discussing this beautiful piece becoming a book. I guess my last question before we have to go is, when the movie, the major motion picture is made, who's gonna play you guys? I mean, I already know who I think should play you, but who do you think?
Oh, there was somebody, and I'm trying to remember. See, that's a terrible. You go first, Susan.
I have to think about that. Nobody's ever asked that question.
That's a good question. I'm trying to, because we were talking about getting this guy to do a reading, and I'm trying to remember the name.
I think Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan. That's
okay.
There you go. And you know what? If you set up a meeting with Oprah Winfrey, I will try to convince her that that's the movie to make.
She should.
All right.
Now, see, this is Oprah stuff. But,
Sure.
Look, I do want to say a couple of really important things. You're right at the beginning. First of all, faith is a crucial part. Actually, if you'll, with the permission, because I know we're running out of time, maybe we'll go right to this. But I do want to say, Susan talks about being brave and doing this thing, and she has survived. She's an unlikely survivor, and not talking about and thinking about negative. It's always important to note that it's never the patient's fault. That you can do everything right and still it doesn't work out. It's not your fault. We're lucky, and doing the right things have helped. And since her, as part of her recovery, she does right diet, right exercise, and the positive frame of mind is very important. But you can have all of that, and the cancer can still win. And I think we need to know that. And also, I've been told by some of the most prominent psychiatrists in the world, I will never know what it would have been like had she died. This is the story of anticipating the loss, and anticipatory grief can be as bad, or I've done a lot of thinking about this, and it's getting ready for the unknown. And that's really hard. Once something has happened, then there is a recovery, a recovery, as a rabbi said to me, it's waking up one morning, having realized you're still here, and that you will have a new name and a new mission in life, but you'll always have a little bit of a limp. Jacob, in fact, because you can go on with life, but there'll be a moment that you're not so sure. And the rabbi used that example to me about how to think about this when people talk about that.
And I think this brings us right back to where we started. One of the things about the Jewish people that I find the most extraordinary is our ability to survive.
Yeah.
In spite of the troubles, in spite of the persecution, in spite of the pogroms, in spite of the diseases, in spite of everything, we not only survive, but we also thrive. And we come up with ways to deal with it. You wrote a play. I wrote several plays. No, but in a way, my being Jewish has provided me with an enormous source of creative construction. Resilience. And so on that note of resilience, where do people buy your book? What is the best way to find you?
Any book platform you want. They're on every book platform, not necessarily every show in every store, but many stores as well, but online for whatever your favorite platform, from Goodreads to Amazon. That's the opposite spectrums for.
And your website is?
www.theactualdance.com, and you can get it there. If I can, I want to give you a last bit of Judaism in a poem, because I'm doing a little Kabbalah right now.
Please.
And it's resonating with me because it talks, ours is a love story. And I've come to believe that with a partner, someone you love, that you are somehow interconnected. And I was moved to write it's a very short poem that reflects this idea, and it's called Us. And just goes like this: life exists in each of us as a form of the divine, a tangible essence of who we are. Love is when our essence became entwined, each an equal half of the other. I love you simply awakens the us in you and me. And on that note, the Kabbalah talks about spirit and the unseen that's in everyone and how we are connected by God. And I do think that we can become one in soul with those we love. And so thank you for doing this.
Thank you for joining me. I couldn't be more honored, ladies and gentlemen. Sam and Susan Simon, The Actual Dance. Find it, read it, watch it, support it, share it. And Sam and Susan, I look forward to seeing you soon, speaking with you again. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for following our show, Shmoozing with Avi. And thank you for supporting the work of Why I Love Jewish. Thank you.
Thank you.